She was 35 years old, and the fever that took her husband took him in 4 days, leaving her a widow before the wheat had even finished ripening in the fields they had worked together for 11 years. The man who held the note on their farm was a banker named Horace Delling, who called on her within a fortnight of the burial to explain, with a courtesy that did nothing to soften the substance of his message, that a widow without sons old enough to work the land represented, in his professional judgment, too great a risk for the bank to continue carrying, and that she would need to vacate within the season. What she had left, once the farm was sold to settle the note and its accumulated interest, was $32, her husband's pocket watch, and a grief she had not yet found the bottom of. She spent a portion of that $32 in the dusty mission town of Alameda Springs, on a crumbling, long-abandoned bell tower that had once stood attached to the region's original adobe mission chapel, a purchase the town considered proof that sorrow had finally unmoored her good sense entirely. They said a section of the tower's thick adobe wall had been sealed and plastered over so long ago that no one still living could say what lay behind it. What she found when she finally broke through that wall would not just answer a question the mission's own founding priests had carried to their graves. It would return to Alameda Springs something the whole town had spent 2 generations believing was lost. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Perpetua Reyes. If you have ever lost one person who made a place feel like home, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Perpetua Reyes had been born Perpetua Salcedo in the small mission settlement of Alameda Springs, nestled in a fertile valley where the old Spanish mission had, generations before her birth, established the first orchards and irrigation channels that still, in her own time, sustained the region's modest agricultural prosperity, and she was raised by her father, Rafael Salcedo, a mason and adobe builder whose family had worked in service to the mission since its earliest founding decades, repairing its walls, maintaining its chapel, and passing down, generation to generation, a body of practical knowledge about adobe construction that few in the region possessed with the same depth. Raphael was a quiet, deeply careful man who approached his craft with something close to reverence, teaching his daughter from an early age that adobe, properly understood, was not merely mud and straw but a living material that breathed and settled and told the truth of its own history to anyone patient enough to read the subtle variations in its texture and color, variations that could reveal where a wall had been repaired, where a section had been rebuilt after damage, and, occasionally, where something had been deliberately concealed within a wall's thickness by builders working with purpose rather than mere necessity. Perpetua's mother, Dolores, died giving birth to a younger brother who did not survive infancy, leaving Raphael to raise his daughter alone from the time she was 7, and in the years that followed, unable to afford proper apprenticeship arrangements for a son he did not have, Raphael simply brought Perpetua into his own work, teaching her to mix adobe in the traditional proportions, to recognize good clay soil from poor, to lay courses evenly, and to repair damage in a manner nearly invisible to any eye but a trained mason's own. This was, in the small, tradition-bound world of Alameda Springs, considered somewhat unusual for a girl, but Raphael's evident skill and the family's long service to the mission earned him enough local respect that few openly questioned his choice to train his daughter in a trade she showed genuine aptitude for, and Perpetua grew up spending long afternoons at her father's side among the mission's aging walls, absorbing not only practical technique, but her father's deeper conviction that buildings, properly cared for, held memory the way people did, and that a good mason's duty extended beyond mere structural soundness into a kind of stewardship of that memory. It was in these years, working alongside her father on repairs to the mission's own bell tower, a structure that had stood detached from the main chapel since a partial collapse decade before her birth had necessitated its rebuilding, that Perpetua first noticed the tower's unusual construction, a section of unusually thick wall near its base that her father, when she asked about it as a girl of perhaps 10, explained only that some walls were built thick for reasons lost to time, an answer that satisfied her curiosity then but that she would remember decades later, with an entirely different weight of meaning. She met Joaquin Reyes at 19, a hard-working young farmer whose family held modest but productive land at the valley's edge, and their courtship, conducted with the unhurried patience typical of the region's traditions, led to marriage when she was 21, a union that brought her, in the 11 years that followed, genuine contentment working alongside Joaquin on their shared land, tending crops and raising the modest, steady prosperity of a well-managed farm, though they were never blessed with children of their own, a private sorrow the couple bore together with the same quiet resilience it brought to every other hardship the land occasionally handed them. It is worth understanding. before the rest of this story unfolds, that Perpetua's deep, inherited fluency in the language of Adobe construction, absorbed at her father's side through years of patient practice, would prove to be the exact skill that later unlocked the secret the mission's own bell tower had carried in silence for well over half a century. Though in the ordinary contentment of her married years, she had no particular reason to expect any of it would ever matter again. The fall came with the swiftness of the fever itself, Joaquin falling ill on a Tuesday with what seemed at first no more than ordinary exhaustion from the harvest, and dead by Saturday morning despite every remedy Perpetua and the valley's aging physician could attempt, a loss so sudden and so complete that Perpetua found herself, in the numb weeks that followed, scarcely able to process the full weight of what had happened before she was confronted with the additional, entirely practical catastrophe of the farm's finances. Joaquin, like many farmers in the region, had carried a modest mortgage against the land through the regional bank in the nearby town of Castaneda, a debt that had never troubled the couple during Joaquin's lifetime given the farm's steady productivity, but that Horace Delling, the bank's manager, now regarded with open skepticism once he learned there was no mailer prepared to continue working the land. His stated concern being the bank's exposure to risk, but his manner suggesting, too, Perpetua's grieving but still sharply observant mind, something closer to simple unwillingness to extend the same patience to a widow that he would have extended to a grieving widow in her position. Delling called on her personally within 2 weeks of Joaquin's burial, expressing sympathy that struck Perpetua as perfunctory rather than genuine, and explaining that given the farm's now uncertain management, the bank would require the note settled in full within the season rather than continuing under its original terms, a demand that left Perpetua no realistic option beyond selling the farm outright to satisfy the debt, since no buyer would purchase productive farmland while still assuming an outstanding mortgage, and Perpetua herself had no capital to pay down the note while continuing to work the land alone. She fought this outcome as best she could, appealing to Delling's stated policies and even traveling to the regional territorial capital to inquire whether any agricultural relief programs might apply to her circumstances, but found, at every turn, that a widow without male family to vouch for her simply lacked the standing to secure any meaningful accommodation, and by the season's end the farm was sold, the proceeds settling Joaquin's debt with almost nothing remaining, the modest surplus. Perpetua had hoped might sustain her through a difficult transition period consumed instead by legal fees and the bank's own aggressive accounting of accrued interest. What remained to her, when the sale was finally complete, was $32, Joaquin's pocket watch which he had kept rather than sold despite its modest resale value, and a grief compounded now by genuine material uncertainty about how she would sustain herself going forward, her own father having died some years before and left her no property of her own to fall back upon. Perpetua spent several difficult weeks in this uncertain state, taking and mending and occasional cooking work for Alameda Springs families who remembered her father's service to the mission with enough residual goodwill to offer what small charity they could, and it was during this period, walking past the old mission grounds on an errand one afternoon, that she found herself looking up at the abandoned bell tower her father had helped rebuild decades before, standing detached and unused since. The mission itself had been formally decommissioned some years prior when the diocese consolidated its regional operations into the newer, larger church in Castaneda, leaving the original mission buildings, including its freestanding bell tower, in a state of gradual, unmourned decay that the town had simply grown accustomed to ignoring. The county, Perpetua learned through a conversation with a sympathetic clerk while inquiring about any available work in the county offices, had recently taken formal possession of the old mission property through a tax settlement with the diocese, which had shown no continued interest in maintaining buildings it no longer actively used, and the clerk mentioned, almost as an aside, that the county intended to eventually clear the crumbling bell tower entirely, considering it a safety hazard, rather than a structure worth preserving, though in the meantime it remained available for purchase by anyone willing to take on both the property and the liability it represented. Something in Perpetua, hearing this, felt less like calculated opportunity and more like an almost involuntary pull toward the one structure in Alameda Springs that still carried her father's careful handiwork within its walls, a connection to both her father and, through him, to the deeper history of the town itself that felt, in her grief-stricken and uncertain state, like something worth claiming even if she could not fully articulate why. She offered her $32 for the tower and its small surrounding plot of mission land, an offer the county accepted with evident relief at being freed of the property's liability, and the transaction drew exactly the reaction from Alameda Springs residents that such an evidently impractical purchase might be expected to draw, several townsfolk expressing open concern that the widow Reyes had let her grief carry her into poor judgment, spending what little remained of her resources on a crumbling ruin rather than securing more practical shelter or provisions. Perpetua herself, walking the tower's interior for the first time as its legal owner, found the structure in a state of genuine disrepair. Its upper section, which had once housed the mission bells before they were removed to the new Castaneda Church during the consolidation, now open to the weather through a partially collapsed roof, though the tower's lower section, built with the thick, careful walls her father had always maintained in its construction, remained structurally sound despite decades of neglect. It was in this lower section, running her hands along the walls in the same practiced, assessing manner her father had taught her decade before, that Perpetua's trained eye caught what an untrained observer would certainly have missed, a section of wall near the tower's base, roughly the width and height of a standing man, where the adobe's texture and slightly different coloration suggested a repair or addition made at some point after the wall's original construction. Precisely the kind of subtle variation her father had once dismissed, when she was a girl of 10, as simply built thick for reasons lost to time. Perpetua stood before that section of wall for a long while that first afternoon, memory stirring of her father's careful evasiveness on the subject decade before, and something in her, some combination of grief for the father she had lost and curiosity awakened by the very skill he had given her, resolved that she would not simply let this particular mystery remain lost to time as he apparently had, whether from his own uncertainty or from some deliberate discretion she had never fully understood. Perpetua spent the following weeks establishing herself in the tower's more habitable ground floor, patching what she could of the roof above to at least slow further weather damage, and subsisting largely on the same modest mending and cooking work that had sustained her through the difficult weeks before her purchase, work that occupied her days while her evenings increasingly returned to careful examination of that suspicious section of wall, approaching the question with the same patient, methodical attention her father had brought to every aspect of his craft. She began by researching what she could of the mission's own history through what records survived in the Castaneda Church's archives, records a sympathetic new priest allowed her to examine once she explained her father's long service to the original mission, and it was in these archives that she found reference to a period, some 60 years before her own birth, when the mission had briefly served a significantly larger population than its later diminished congregation would suggest, a period coinciding with a wave of settlement that had, according to the fragmentary records, ended abruptly following what the archives described only as difficulties with certain regional authorities that led several mission families to depart the valley entirely within a short span of years. This vague, evidently deliberately unspecific account troubled Perpetua's careful mind in a way she could not immediately articulate, and it was a chance conversation with Alameda Springs' oldest living resident, a woman named Encarnacion Vidal, who at nearly 90 remembered stories passed down from her own grandmother about the mission's earlier years, that provided the first substantive thread Perpetua could follow. Encarnacion recalled, with a particular clarity the very old sometimes bring to inherited memory, a story about a mission priest named Father Anselmo Cruz, who had served Alameda Springs during that earlier, more populous period, and who had, according to the story Encarnacion's grandmother always told with a certain lowered voice, kept careful records not just of the mission's religious affairs but of land grants and water rights the mission had helped negotiate on behalf of the valleys. Original settling families, records that Encarnacion's grandmother insisted had simply vanished when Father Cruz himself was abruptly reassigned away from a mission under circumstances the story never fully explained, an event that, Encarnacion believed, coincided roughly with the same wave of departures Perpetua had found reference in the church archives. Working from this thread, Perpetua approached the wall's suspicious section with fresh purpose, and using tools she had inherited from her father's own collection along with techniques he had taught her for careful, minimally destructive removal of adobe without damaging whatever might lie behind it. She spent nearly a week of careful evening labor gradually working through the sealed section, finding, as she worked deeper, that the wall's unusual thickness indeed concealed a genuine cavity, rather than simply representing a structural reinforcement, a discovery that filled her with a mixture of anticipation and something close to dread as she considered what decades of concealment might have been protecting or hiding. What Perpetua finally uncovered, Breaking through the final layer of adobe on a cool evening with her lantern held close against the tower's deepening shadows was not treasure in any conventional sense, but something that struck her, once she understood its full significance, as considerably more valuable to Alameda Springs than any quantity of gold or silver might have been. A weathered wooden chest containing a substantial collection of carefully preserved documents, wrapped in oilcloth, that had protected them remarkably well across more than 6 decades of sealed concealment, documents that, upon careful examination by lamplight that stretched deep into the night, revealed themselves to be Father Anselmo Cruz's original mission records, including detailed land grant documentation and water rights agreements negotiated on behalf of the valley's earliest settling families. Records that corresponded precisely to the vague difficulties with certain regional authorities church archives had referenced but never explained. As Perpetua worked through the documents over the following days, cross-referencing family names against Alameda Springs' current residents with the help of Encarnacion Vidal's remarkable memory for local lineages, a considerably more troubling picture began to emerge than she had initially anticipated. The records showed that in the years following the original settlement, a regional land speculator named Cornelius Ashby had systematically challenged the legitimacy of the mission's original water rights agreements, arguing through territorial courts that the mission lacked proper authority to have granted certain rights in the first place, a legal campaign that had ultimately succeeded, according to later records also preserved in the chest, in transferring substantial water access from several original settling families to Ashby's own considerably more prosperous ranching operation, a transfer that Father Cruz's own preserved correspondence made clear he believed was fraudulent, built on deliberately falsified challenges to agreements he had personally witnessed and could prove were legitimate, evidence he had apparently gathered and preserved specifically to eventually contest the ruling, though his sudden reassignment away from Alameda Springs, which his correspondence suggested came at Ashby's direct instigation through influential contacts within the diocese, had prevented him from ever formally presenting that evidence before any court. Perpetua understood, reading through Father Cruz's careful, increasingly urgent correspondence in his final months of the mission, that he had likely sealed these records within the bell tower's wall specifically because he feared, correctly as history had proven, that his removal from Alameda Springs was imminent, and that he had trusted, in a manner remarkably similar to how Perpetua's own father had once cryptically described the wall as built thick for reasons lost of time, that someone eventually would recover the truth he had been prevented from presenting himself. What struck Perpetua most forcefully, working through these decades-old documents by lantern light, was a discovery that the water rights in question, now held by Ashby's ranching operation under the name of his son and current heir, Reginald Ashby, remained the primary source of irrigation for the very valley lands that had once belonged to the families Father Cruz's records named, families whose modern descendants, Perpetua realized with growing understanding, still lived throughout Alameda Springs today, farming reduced acreage and paying considerable fees for water access to a ranching operation that, according to the very document she now held, had never legitimately possessed the right to control that water in the first place. Word that Perpetua Reyes had discovered something significant sealed within the old mission bell tower spread through Alameda Springs within days, the story growing more elaborate with each retelling in the manner such news always does in a small valley starved for genuine novelty, and it did not take long for that word to reach Reginald Ashby himself, who had inherited his father's ranching operation and its considerable water rights holdings some years before, and who had, in the decade since, built a reputation as one of the valley's most prosperous and civically prominent citizens, his family's continued control over the region's water access having proven, across 2 generations, an extraordinarily reliable source of both wealth and local influence. Ashby called on Perpetua personally within the week, presenting himself with a polished, avuncular courtesy that reminded her uncomfortably of Horace Delling's own perfunctory sympathy months before, expressing concern for her circumstances as a struggling widow and offering, with apparent generosity, to purchase the old document she had found for some considerably beyond what such papers might ordinarily be worth, framing the offer as simple charitable interest in local historical curiosities rather than any acknowledgement of what those documents actually threatened to reveal about his family's water rights claims. Perpetua, drawing on the same measured, patient composure her father had modeled throughout a lifetime of careful craftsmanship, thanked Ashby for his interest and told him she required time to properly understand what she had found before making any decisions regarding the documents, revealing nothing of the extent to which he had already grasped their significance. In the days that followed, the pressure grew considerably less Curtis, the modest mending and cooking work that had sustained her through the difficult months since Joaquin's death dried up with suspicious suddenness as several regular clients found other arrangements. A local carpenter who had agreed to help repair the bell tower's damaged roof discovered he was unexpectedly too occupied with other commitments to continue the work. And Encarnacion Vidal confided, in a hushed and worried conversation, that her own grandson, who leased grazing land from an Ashby cousin, had received a pointed inquiry about whether his grandmother's continued friendliness toward the widow Reyes might affect the terms of his lease going forward. Perpetua recognized in this escalating pattern the same kind of institutional leverage that had apparently allowed the Ashby family to consolidate their water rights control across 2 generations without meaningful local challenge, precisely the leverage that had once helped drive Father Anselmo Cruz from Alameda Springs before he could present his own evidence. And she understood that pursuing the matter through any official channel the Ashby family's considerable regional influence might reach, which in a valley this size meant nearly every available channel, risked seeing Father Cruz's carefully preserved evidence suppressed a second time, 60 years after it had first been sealed away specifically to prevent exactly that outcome. Rather than risk that second suppression, Perpetua made the decision that had been forming steadily in her mind since her first full understanding of Father Cruz's documents. She would bring the evidence directly to the descendants of the original settling families themselves, the very people whose water rights the documents proved had been fraudulently transferred, trusting that a unified community claim, grounded in documented historical evidence and pursued through the valley's own collective memory and testimony, would prove far harder for the Ashby family to suppress or dismiss than any single widow's isolated claim. She spent the following weeks working with Encarnacion Vidal's remarkable knowledge of local lineages to identify each family whose ancestors appeared in Father Cruz's original documentation. Families like the Montoyas and the Figueroas who still farmed reduced acreage throughout the valley and who, Perpetua discovered in conversation after conversation, had long harbored a vague, unprovable sense that their water access had always seemed unfairly constrained relative to what their own family. Stories suggested their ancestors had originally been granted, suspicions that had never crystallized into formal challenge given the absence of any documentary evidence and the Ashby family's considerable local standing. Among these was an elderly farmer named Tomas Figueroa, whose family had worked the same modest plot for 4 generations under increasingly restrictive water access arrangements, and who wept upon seeing Father Cruz's original land grant documentation confirming water rights considerably more generous than what his family had actually received for decades. The particular grief of a man given long overdue validation for a constraint his family had simply learned, across generations, to accept as an unchangeable fact of valley life. Perpetua gathered 6 affected families over the following month, and on a Sunday gathering at the rebuilt Castaneda Church, the largest gathering space available to the valley's Catholic community and one with genuine historical connection to the original mission's own religious authority, she stood before an assembly that included not only the affected families but much of Alameda Springs' broader population, drawn by weeks of accumulating rumor about what the widow Reyes had found sealed within the old bell tower, and presented, with the same patient thoroughness her father had brought to every careful task, the complete story of Father Anselmo Cruz, of the bell tower wall that had preserved his evidence for over 60 years, and of the water rights fraud his careful documentation proved beyond reasonable dispute. She read from Father Cruz's own correspondence. She presented the original land grant documents alongside the current water access arrangements the Ashby family maintained, allowing the assembled families to see directly the gap between what history proved they were owed and what they currently received. Reginald Ashby, present in the gathering as he was present at nearly every significant valley occasion, attempted initially to dismiss the entire matter as unreliable, decades-old paperwork of uncertain provenance, but his composure faltered visibly as family after family stepped forward with their own long-held suspicions now finally corroborated by documentary evidence. And by the time the Territorial Water Rights Commission, petitioned by a unified delegation of the valley's oldest farming families rather than any channel Ashby's influence might have reached, opened formal proceedings the following month, the combination of Father Cruz's meticulous original documentation and the collective testimony of 6 affected families proved more than sufficient to compel a genuine reconsideration of water rights that had stood unchallenged for over 60 years. The restoration that followed unfolded over the course of the following year through the deliberate, methodical process such formal water rights proceedings inevitably require. but it unfolded with genuine and lasting substance, the Territorial Commission ultimately restoring meaningful water access to all 6 affected families based on Father Cruz's original documentation, access that, while requiring the Ashby ranching operation to relinquish a portion of its own long-held water rights, still left the family with considerable resources given the scale of their broad operation, a resolution that satisfied the formal requirements of justice without descending into any punitive excess that might have struck the community as vindictive rather than restorative. Tomas Figueroa and the other affected families found their farming operation genuinely transformed by the restored access, able for the first time in generations to work their full acreage without the water constraints that had shaped and limited their family prosperity for decades, a change that rippled outward through Alameda Springs' broader economy as those families expanded their own production and, in time, increased their own capacity to support the valley's other small businesses and craftspeople. Reginald Ashby, though he faced no criminal proceedings given the passage of time and his own personal distance from his father's original fraudulent legal campaign, found his standing in Alameda Springs permanently altered. The easy civic deference the valley had long extended to the Ashby name curdling into a more wary, transactional relationship that no amount of the family's remaining wealth could fully restore to its previous warmth, a quiet social reckoning Perpetua had never directly sought, but that the valley arrived at on its own once the documented truth stood plainly before everyone. As for the bell tower itself, Perpetua, once the water rights proceedings included in Father Cruz's documents had served their essential purpose, worked with a new Castaneda priest and several of the newly restored families to properly repair the structure, restoring it not as an active mission building but as a small local historical site honoring both the original mission's founding history and, at Encarnacion Vidal's specific and insistent suggestion, Father Anselmo Cruz's own quiet, decades-delayed act of justice, a modest plaque eventually placed near the repaired wall explaining, in simple terms, what had once been sealed there and why. It is worth remembering, in the end, that Perpetua Reyes began this story as a woman who had lost, in a matter of days, both her husband and the life they had carefully built together, left with $32 and a grief she had not yet found the bottom of. She did not buy a crumbling bell tower expecting treasure. She bought it because it was the one structure in Alameda Springs that still carried her father's careful handiwork within its walls, and because something in his old lessons about buildings holding memory the way people did had never quite left her. What she found behind that sealed wall was not gold in any literal sense, though it ultimately restored real, meaningful prosperity to 6 farming families, but something Alameda Springs needed far more urgently, a 60-year-old truth Father Cruz had sacrificed his own ministry to preserve, and the patient, careful work of finally bringing it into the light he had always trusted it would eventually reach. Thank you for spending this time with Perpetua's story, and with all of us who gather here to remember what patient, careful attention can restore. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who has ever tried to hold on to a piece of a life or a person they lost far too soon. We would love to hear from you in the comments below. What is a time you found real value in something others had already written off as worthless or forgotten? We read every story you share with us, and we are always moved by how many of you carry your own quiet perpetuas within your history. Until next time, stay close.